My father raised a champagne glass at my sister's wedding and calmly told more than 1,000 guests that I was a mistake our family should have erased years ago. For a moment, the entire golf course fell silent beneath the wedding lights. The ceremony had been designed to look perfect. White tents stretched across the emerald lawn of the private club outside the city. Crystal chandeliers hung above rows of guests from the diamond trade, fashion houses, investment firms, and old money families who had flown in for the Simmons wedding. Cameras moved slowly across the crowd, while enormous LED screens displayed photographs of our family smiling beside yachts, charity galas, and magazine covers. From the outside, it looked like the celebration of a flawless dynasty. My sister Victoria stood at the center of the stage beside her new husband, her gown shimmering under the lights like a cascade of diamonds. The orchestra played softly behind her while my father stepped forward to deliver the traditional toast. He lifted his glass with the polished confidence that had made him famous in business circles and praised Victoria as the daughter who carried the honor of the Simmons name. The guests applauded politely. Then his gaze shifted toward the back of the lawn, toward me. His expression didn't change, but his voice cooled just enough to tighten the air around the stage. "As for the other one," he said slowly, not even using my name, "that child was a mistake we carried far longer than we should have." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd like wind across water. My mother leaned toward the microphone beside him and laughed softly, the way she did when gossip surfaced at charity events. "Honestly," she added lightly, "we should have sent her away when she was little." For a single frozen second, the entire wedding stopped breathing. More than 1,000 guests turned in their seats. Every pair of eyes searched the lawn until they found the only person standing alone at the back of the ceremony. Me. My name is Rachel Simmons, and that was the moment my father erased me from our family in front of the world. I stood near a row of decorative lanterns at the edge of the golf course, watching strangers study my face the way people watch the beginning of a scandal. Some looked embarrassed. Some looked curious. Most simply waited to see whether I would break. But I didn't move. My hands stayed steady on the strap of the small leather purse hanging from my shoulder. For years, I had imagined what it might feel like if the truth about the Simmons family ever surfaced in public. I had always thought I would cry or shout or run across the lawn demanding an explanation. Instead, something colder than anger settled quietly in my chest. Inside my purse were the only two things I had brought to the wedding that actually mattered. One was an old photograph of my grandfather, Samuel Simmons, taken during the last summer before he died. In the picture, he stood beside me on the porch of his estate, one weathered hand resting gently on my shoulder, while the afternoon sun caught the edges of his gray hair beneath the wide hat he wore whenever he worked outside. The other item was a sealed envelope marked with dark red wax. My grandfather had placed that envelope in my hands only days before his death. He told me not to open it until the day I finally understood the truth about our family. For years, I carried it without breaking the seal. On the stage, the ceremony tried awkwardly to continue. The orchestra resumed its melody. The wedding planner whispered instructions behind the curtains, and my father lifted his glass again as though nothing unusual had happened. Victoria forced a bright smile for the cameras, though confusion flickered briefly across her face. For the guests seated across the glowing lawn, the moment would become a story they repeated at dinners and charity galas. For me, it meant something entirely different. I turned away from the stage without saying a word. No one followed me. The grass beneath my shoes felt soft and strangely distant as I walked across the darker edge of the golf course toward the parking area. Behind me, the celebration slowly recovered its rhythm. Music returned. Laughter rose again in cautious waves. My parents believed they had simply removed an embarrassment from their perfect portrait in front of an audience large enough to make the humiliation permanent. What they didn't understand was that the moment my father called me a mistake in front of the entire world was not the end of my place in the Simmons story. It was the beginning of something they had never prepared for. As I stepped beyond the wedding lights and onto the quiet path leading toward the parking lot, My hand tightened around the purse at my side. Inside it, the photograph of my grandfather and the sealed envelope rested silently against each other. And in the back of my mind, a sentence he once whispered to me years earlier returned with unsettling clarity. One day the truth about this family will demand its price. I drove away from the golf course long before the music faded behind me, following the narrow road that wound through the dark hills surrounding the Simmons estate. The wedding lights slowly disappeared in my rearview mirror until they looked like nothing more than distant stars scattered across the valley. Anyone watching might have believed I had simply left early because of embarrassment, but the truth was quieter and far more complicated than that. I had spent most of my life standing just outside the picture my parents carefully painted for the world. That night was simply the first time the frame had cracked in front of an audience large enough to matter. The Simmons family had always been admired in our city. My father, Marcus Simmons, was known as one of the most successful diamond merchants in the international trade. His company supplied rare stones to collectors, luxury jewelers, and investors across several continents. My mother, Evelyn Simmons, ran a fashion brand that appeared regularly in society magazines beside photographs of charity events and cultural galas. To outsiders, we looked like the perfect balance of wealth, elegance, and influence. When reporters interviewed my parents, they spoke proudly about family values, tradition, and the importance of legacy. Every public photograph showed the same arrangement. My father standing confidently in the center, my mother beside him in carefully tailored elegance, and my sister Victoria smiling like the future of the Simmons name. Victoria had always fit perfectly inside that picture. From the time she was a child, my parents treated her as the heir to everything they had built. She attended elite schools, spoke confidently at charity events, and understood instinctively how to mirror the expectations of the powerful people who surrounded our family. When guests visited our house for business dinners, my father introduced her proudly, as if she were already part of the empire he planned to leave behind. I remember how easily she moved through those rooms, laughing at the right moments, asking questions that made investors feel respected, learning how to perform the role my parents had designed for her. My place in the family portrait was never as clear. I was the daughter who asked questions when silence would have been easier. I noticed small inconsistencies in conversations that others ignored, and I had a habit of observing people too closely for my parents' comfort. They called it curiosity when I was younger, then stubbornness as I grew older. By the time I was a teenager, the description had evolved into something sharper. According to my parents, I simply had a talent for creating unnecessary complications in situations that were meant to look simple. The only person who never treated my curiosity as a flaw was my grandfather, Samuel Simmons. Long before my father expanded the diamond business into a global empire, my grandfather had built the company with a handful of trusted partners and a reputation for quiet discipline. Unlike Marcus, he never seemed interested in the spotlight that surrounded wealth. He spent most of his time at his old estate outside the city, working through shipping ledgers and reading market reports while the rest of the family attended social events. When I visited him as a child, he spoke to me like someone worth listening to rather than someone who needed to be corrected. 2 summers before he died, I was sitting with him on the wide wooden porch behind his house while the evening sun dipped behind the trees. I must have been 16 then. My grandfather studied me for a long moment and said something that seemed strange at the time. He said that some families were built on loyalty, while others were built on performance. The difference, he explained quietly, only becomes visible when the people involved stop pretending. I didn't fully understand what he meant that day. I thought he was simply offering the kind of philosophical advice older people enjoy giving to younger relatives. A week before his death, he called me into his study and handed me a sealed envelope stamped with red wax. He told me not to open it until I reached a moment when the truth about our family mattered more than protecting its image. I kept that envelope hidden for years, partly because I respected his instructions and partly because some small part of me still hoped the Simmons family really was the successful, admirable household the world believed it to be. Sitting in my car that night after the wedding humiliation, I realized that hope had quietly disappeared. The road ahead stretched through the dark countryside while the city lights flickered faintly on the horizon. For the first time in my life, I understood that the story my parents told the world had never included me as anything more than a supporting detail. And somewhere inside the envelope resting in my purse was a truth my grandfather believed would eventually force that story to change. I didn't drive straight home after leaving the wedding. About 20 minutes outside the city, I pulled into a quiet overlook above the valley where the road curved along the hillside. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, and the wind moved through the trees with a low rustling sound that felt strangely calm after the noise of the wedding. For a long moment, I sat in the driver's seat staring through the windshield, replaying my father's words in my head. He had erased me from the family with the same steady tone he used when announcing new business partnerships. To him, it had probably felt efficient, like removing an inconvenient line from a speech. Eventually, I reached into my purse and pulled out the sealed envelope my grandfather had given me years earlier. The wax seal had cracked slightly from being carried around so often, but the paper itself was still intact. I had held that envelope dozens of times without opening it. Each time I told myself I would wait until the right moment. Sitting there in the darkness after the wedding humiliation, I finally understood that moment had arrived. I broke the wax carefully and unfolded the letter inside. My grandfather's handwriting was firm and deliberate across the page. He began without sentiment, without comforting words about family or forgiveness. Instead, he wrote that the Simmons diamond empire was not as clean as it appeared in magazines and charity speeches. Over the years, he explained, my father had expanded the business through a complicated network of international suppliers and intermediary companies. On the surface, the structure looked legitimate, the kind of global trade system many luxury industries relied on. But my grandfather had noticed irregularities long before his death. Certain shipments passed through unusual ports that had nothing to do with the official trade routes listed in company reports. Certain financial transfers moved between accounts that were technically legal, yet strangely disconnected from the main corporation. As I read further, the letter grew more specific. My grandfather believed that some of those diamond shipments were being used to conceal financial exchanges between partners operating outside the official market. He did not accuse my father directly of illegal activity, but he wrote that Marcus had become increasingly comfortable ignoring details that might threaten the company's reputation. According to him, my father cared more about maintaining the public image of the Simmons empire than about asking difficult questions about the transactions that supported it. Reputation, my grandfather wrote, had slowly replaced integrity as the foundation of the business. The last section of the letter explained why he had given it to me instead of anyone else in the family. My grandfather said he had watched the way I observed people and situations when I thought no one noticed. He believed I had inherited his habit of questioning things that did not quite make sense. Victoria admired my father too much to challenge him, and my mother had built her entire lifestyle around the success of the diamond empire. That left only one person in the family who might eventually look closely enough to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. If the day ever came when the truth mattered more than the illusion, he wrote, I would know what to do. I finished reading and sat quietly in the driver's seat with the letter resting in my lap. The wedding humiliation suddenly felt smaller compared to the larger picture forming in my mind. My father had spent decades constructing a reputation as a brilliant businessman and devoted family man. Yet, according to my grandfather, the empire supporting that reputation might be balanced on secrets no one had been willing to examine too closely. As I folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope, another memory surfaced from several years earlier. During my final year at university, I had completed an internship with a small logistics firm that analyzed international shipping routes. One afternoon, I noticed a series of cargo records connected to a Simmons subsidiary moving through ports that were never mentioned in the company's official trade reports. At the time, I assumed the irregularity was a clerical error and mentioned it casually to my supervisor. He advised me to focus on my assigned tasks instead. I had forgotten about that moment until now. The wind moved across the overlook again, and I looked out over the dark valley where the city lights shimmered in the distance. For the first time, I realized my grandfather had not simply left me a family secret. He had left me a warning about the fragile structure supporting everything my parents had built. If the information in the letter was even partially true, the Simmons empire depended on a delicate balance of silence and reputation. And the moment that balance collapsed, the story my father told the world about our perfect family might collapse with it. I reached my apartment just before midnight, the city quiet in the way it only becomes after the last restaurants close and the traffic finally thins into scattered headlights. I set my purse on the kitchen table and took the letter out again, reading it a second time with slower attention. The first time I had read it with the shock of everything that had happened at the wedding still echoing in my head. Now the words settled differently. My grandfather had not written a dramatic accusation or a confession. What he left behind was something more unsettling. He had left patterns, warnings, and observations that suggested the Simmons empire might be far more complicated than the polished version my parents presented to the world. As I sat there in the quiet kitchen, another realization began forming slowly in my mind. My grandfather's letter focused on the diamond business, but it also hinted that the problems surrounding my family extended beyond trade routes and financial transfers. He wrote several times about the difference between reputation and truth, about how families sometimes become so invested in the image they present that they forget what their lives actually look like behind closed doors. Reading those lines again forced me to think about my parents not as powerful public figures, but as the people I had watched for 20 years inside the same house. From the outside, the marriage between Marcus and Evelyn Simmons had always looked flawless. They attended charity galas together, hosted extravagant holiday parties, and appeared in magazines as an example of wealth balanced with elegance. Guests often commented on how well they complemented each other. My father represented power and financial success. My mother represented style, culture, and social influence. Together, they looked like the perfect partnership for a modern luxury empire. Yet the private atmosphere inside our home had never matched that carefully polished image. My father spent most of his time traveling between international diamond exhibitions, trade conferences, and meetings with investors. When he was home, he treated the house more like a temporary office than a place where family actually existed. Phone calls, shipping reports, and negotiations filled most of his attention. My mother lived in a completely different world that revolved around fashion events, brand launches, and charity boards. Her schedule was filled with social gatherings where influence mattered as much as money. When my parents did appear together, the interaction between them often felt rehearsed, like actors delivering familiar lines in a scene they had performed too many times. Over the years, I had also noticed something else about my mother's life that never quite made sense. The people surrounding her changed constantly. Assistants, investors, stylists, and so-called close friends appeared for short periods and then quietly disappeared. Sometimes I overheard tense conversations in her private office late at night when she believed the rest of the house was asleep. The voices were never loud enough to reveal details, but they always carried the same tone of urgency. At the time, I assumed it was simply the pressure of managing a growing fashion business. Now, with my grandfather's letter resting beside me on the table, those memories felt less innocent. One moment returned with unusual clarity. I was 17 when my mother hosted the launch of a new fashion collection at a downtown hotel. The ballroom was full of journalists, investors, and designers eager to associate themselves with her brand. At one point, I stepped outside the main hall and saw her speaking quietly with a young man near the service corridor. He looked far younger than the executives she usually worked with, and the conversation between them carried a strange intimacy. When she noticed me watching, her expression shifted instantly from warm confidence to something sharper. She dismissed the man quickly and later told me I had misunderstood what I saw. I believed her then because I wanted to believe my parents' lives were simpler than they appeared. Now, sitting alone in my apartment with the letter open beside me, that moment felt like a small piece of a much larger puzzle. My parents' marriage had always seemed stable because both of them benefited from maintaining the illusion. My father needed the image of a respectable family to reinforce his authority in the diamond trade. My mother needed the financial support and social access his business provided. Together, they built a life where appearances mattered more than honesty. The longer I thought about it, the clearer the structure became. The Simmons family was not simply wealthy and successful, it was carefully staged. That realization forced me to look at my own role in the family in a new way. For years, I had been labeled the difficult daughter, the one who asked inconvenient questions and noticed details others ignored. I had spent most of my life believing that meant there was something wrong with me. But my grandfather's letter suggested a different explanation. Maybe the problem was never my curiosity. Maybe the problem was that curiosity had no place in a family built on performance. The clock on the kitchen wall crept past 1 a.m. as I opened my laptop and began searching through old files I had saved over the years. Some came from my internship in logistics. Others were fragments of financial information I had glimpsed during family gatherings when business documents were left unattended on tables. At the time, those details seemed meaningless. Now they looked like scattered threads waiting to be pulled together. As the screen filled with shipment records and company names, I realized something with surprising clarity. The humiliation at the wedding had not pushed me out of the Simmons story. It had simply removed the last reason I ever had to protect it. The next morning arrived quietly, as if the world had decided not to acknowledge what had happened the night before. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows of my apartment and spread across the kitchen floor while the city outside continued its ordinary rhythm. Cars moved through the streets, people walked to work, and somewhere across town my family was likely pretending the wedding humiliation had already been forgotten. For a long time I stood at the counter with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at the documents open on my laptop. The fragments of information I had gathered over the years no longer looked random. They looked like the beginning of a map. There was only one person I trusted enough to show that map to. His name was Liam Carter. We had met during my final year at university while working on a project analyzing international logistics systems. Liam had a way of looking at complicated data that turned confusion into structure. While most people accepted explanations on the surface, he preferred evidence. Over the years, he had also become the only person outside my family who knew that the Simmons empire never felt as stable to me as it appeared to everyone else. When I called him that morning, I didn't begin with the wedding humiliation or the letter my grandfather left behind. I simply told him I had discovered something unusual in a series of shipping records connected to the Simmons company and asked if he could help me understand it. Liam arrived at my apartment later that afternoon carrying his laptop and a stack of reference notes from his consulting work in international trade compliance. We sat across from each other at the dining table while the sunlight shifted slowly across the room. I showed him the files I had collected from my internship years earlier, along with several additional records I had quietly saved from business conversations overheard during family gatherings. He studied the documents carefully, occasionally asking short questions about dates or company names while connecting one piece of information to another. For nearly an hour, the room remained silent, except for the sound of pages turning and keyboard clicks. Finally, Liam leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He explained that none of the records by themselves proved anything illegal. However, when the shipping routes and financial transfers were examined together, they revealed a pattern designed to obscure the movement of extremely valuable cargo. The shipments moved through ports that were technically legal, but rarely used by companies operating openly in the diamond trade. Several of the financial transactions passed through corporations that existed only on paper. If someone wanted to disguise the origin or destination of rare stones, Liam said quietly, this is exactly how they would build the system. The weight of that conclusion settled heavily between us. For years, I had suspected there were details about the Simmons empire my father preferred not to explain. Hearing the structure described clearly made the suspicion feel far more real. I told Liam about the letter my grandfather had written and how it warned that reputation had become more important to my father than truth. Liam listened carefully without interrupting, then asked the question that changed the direction of everything. If all of this turned out to be true, what exactly did I want to happen next? For a moment, I didn't answer. Until that point, I had focused only on understanding the truth about my family. The idea of actually confronting it had remained distant. But the memory of the wedding humiliation returned with sharp clarity. My father's voice announcing that I was a mistake. My mother laughing as if my existence were an inconvenience that should have been corrected years earlier. The humiliation had not created the conflict between us, but it had revealed how easily they could erase me when it suited their image. I told Liam that I didn't want a public scandal built on anger. What I wanted was something far simpler and far more difficult. I wanted the truth to exist somewhere they could not rewrite it. Liam nodded slowly, considering that answer. He explained that if the goal was credibility rather than revenge, then the process had to be careful. Evidence needed to be organized, witnesses needed to be present, and the confrontation had to happen in a place where the story could not be quietly altered afterward. The plan began forming almost naturally from that conversation. Instead of reacting immediately to the wedding humiliation, I would give the situation time to settle. My parents would assume the incident had pushed me back into silence. During that time, Liam and I would organize the information into something stronger than scattered suspicion. When the evidence was clear enough, I would invite my parents and my sister to dinner at my apartment under the pretense of repairing the damage from the wedding. They would arrive expecting apology and reconciliation. Instead, they would find themselves sitting across a table from the daughter they had publicly erased, while the truth about the empire they protected unfolded quietly in front of them. When Liam finally left that evening, the city lights were beginning to glow outside the windows again. I stood alone in the quiet apartment, looking at the folders of documents arranged across the table. My parents believed the humiliation at the wedding had ended my place in their story. What they did not understand was that the moment they chose that stage for their cruelty was the same moment I stopped protecting the version of our family they had spent a lifetime performing for the world. 2 days after the wedding, I sent the message that would begin the next stage of everything. I kept the text short and restrained, exactly the way Liam suggested. I wrote that the scene at the wedding had become uncomfortable for everyone, and that I didn't want the family to remain divided because of a misunderstanding. I said I thought it would be better if we spoke privately, away from guests and cameras. Then I invited my parents and my sister to dinner at my apartment the following evening. The tone of the message sounded careful, almost apologetic, the way someone might write when trying to repair a mistake. That was intentional. My parents had always been most comfortable when they believed they still controlled the story. My father replied first. His message was brief and cold but predictable. He wrote that if I was finally ready to behave like an adult, he would attend. My mother didn't respond for several hours, but later that afternoon she confirmed that they would come. Victoria answered last. Her message was cautious, asking whether the dinner was meant to calm things down after the embarrassment of the wedding. I told her it was. That wasn't entirely a lie. The purpose of the dinner was to calm something down, just not the wedding incident. The following day passed quietly, but not idly. Liam arrived at my apartment early in the afternoon carrying printed copies of the records we had organized together. We spread the documents across the dining table and reviewed them again carefully. One folder contained the shipping records showing diamond shipments routed through unusual ports. Another held the financial transfers connected to companies that existed only on paper. A third folder contained cross-references linking several of those transactions to corporations registered in places known for protecting hidden ownership. None of the documents looked dramatic on their own, but when arranged together, they formed a structure that was extremely difficult to ignore. We also agreed that Liam would remain present during the dinner, but not seated at the table with us. Officially, he would be there helping me test a projector system for a consulting presentation I claimed to be preparing later that week. In reality, his presence served a more important purpose. Liam understood the technical details behind the documents far better than I did, and if my father attempted to dismiss the evidence as meaningless speculation, Liam could quietly confirm the significance of what the records showed. The goal was not to create a theatrical confrontation. The goal was to make sure the truth had structure once it was spoken. By the time evening arrived, my apartment looked calm enough to support the story I had told in my message. The dining table was set neatly with 4 place settings. A simple meal waited in the kitchen so the evening would appear ordinary at first. The folders containing the documents rested inside a drawer beside the table where I could reach them easily. When I stepped back and looked around the room, it reminded me of the way my mother used to prepare our house before hosting important guests. Everything appeared controlled, welcoming, and civilized on the surface. Beneath that calm arrangement, however, was the quiet tension of something about to change. My parents arrived first. My father stepped into the apartment with the same confident posture he carried into business meetings, as if he expected the evening to revolve around his authority. My mother followed beside him, dressed with her usual polished elegance, though her expression showed a trace of impatience. Victoria arrived a few minutes later and greeted me with visible uncertainty. For the first several minutes, the conversation remained polite. We spoke about harmless topics while plates were passed across the table and glasses were filled with water. Anyone watching from the outside would have assumed the dinner was exactly what my message promised. Eventually, my father placed his glass down and addressed me directly. He said he assumed I had invited them because I realized the scene at the wedding had become unnecessarily dramatic. Public emotions, he explained calmly, sometimes caused people to misinterpret situations, and he hoped I now understood that protecting the family reputation had to remain the priority. My mother nodded beside him as if the matter were already settled. Victoria watched the exchange quietly, her expression uncertain. Instead of responding immediately, I stood up and walked to the drawer beside the table. When I returned, I placed the first folder in the center of the table and opened it slowly. The room grew silent in a way that felt heavier than any argument. My father frowned slightly as he glanced at the pages, initially assuming they were unrelated business documents. Then his eyes stopped on the shipment numbers printed across the records. The confidence in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I explained calmly that over the past several years, I had come across certain records connected to the Simmons Diamond Network while studying international shipping systems. At first, the information looked confusing but harmless. However, when I compared those records with the letter my grandfather left behind, the pattern became difficult to ignore. I slid the second folder toward my father and opened it as well, revealing the financial transfers linked to the same shipments. At that moment, Liam stepped quietly into the room and leaned against the wall near the dining area, observing without interrupting. My mother's hand froze around her glass as she realized the discussion was no longer about the wedding. Victoria looked from one document to another, trying to understand what she was seeing. My father remained silent for several seconds before asking where I had obtained the records. His voice was still controlled, but the sharp edge beneath it was impossible to miss. I told him the truth. The information came from several places over the years, including my grandfather's warning and my own research. No one spoke for several seconds after that. The dinner had started as a polite attempt to repair the family image. Now the truth about the empire behind that image was sitting quietly in the center of the table where it could no longer be ignored. The dinner ended without shouting, and without the kind of dramatic explosion my father had expected to control. Instead, it ended in silence. My parents left my apartment earlier than planned, carrying the same calm expressions they used at public events where losing control would damage their image. Victoria lingered longer than the others, standing near the door as if she wanted to say something but could not find the words. When she finally stepped out into the hallway, the quiet inside the apartment felt heavier than any argument that might have happened. Liam remained seated at the table for several minutes after the door closed. He gathered the documents slowly and placed them back into the folders we had prepared. Neither of us spoke right away. Eventually, he looked up at me and said something simple. People who build their power on reputation rarely panic in front of witnesses. They leave the room calmly and begin protecting themselves somewhere else. The real consequences always start later, after the silence spreads. For the next few days, nothing visible changed. My father did not call. My mother did not send messages demanding explanations. Victoria texted once, asking if the documents were real, and when I told her they were, she did not continue the conversation. From the outside, it might have looked as if the confrontation at dinner had meant nothing. The Simmons name still appeared in business headlines. My mother's fashion brand still promoted new collections, and society pages continued showing photographs from the wedding celebration. Yet beneath that calm surface, something had begun shifting. The first signs appeared quietly inside the diamond trade itself. My father's business depended on a network of partners who trusted the stability of the Simmons empire. Within days, several of those partners began asking questions about shipments that had passed through unfamiliar ports. The questions were not accusations. They were requests for clarification, the kind that appear when experienced investors sense that something in the system has changed. Uncertainty spreads quickly in industries built on trust. One partner delayed a shipment while reviewing compliance documentation connected to earlier transactions. Another investor requested additional verification for a contract that had previously been routine. None of these actions were dramatic enough to attract media attention, but they created a ripple effect through the network that supported my father's business. Confidence had always been the invisible currency of the Simmons empire. Once doubt entered the system, even small concerns carried unexpected weight. My mother's world began shifting at the same time. Her fashion brand relied heavily on influence within certain social circles where reputation mattered as much as profit. Within those circles, rumors travel faster than official announcements. Some of those rumors began with financial records connected to the same shell companies appearing in the shipping documents. Others emerged from individuals who had quietly noticed unusual transfers between private accounts associated with her business. Invitations that once arrived automatically began disappearing from her schedule. Conversations that once praised her success grew cautious. Victoria experienced the consequences in a different way. At first, she tried to believe that the dinner confrontation had simply been an exaggeration of incomplete information. But as the week progressed, she began hearing the same questions repeated by friends, colleagues, and even members of the family she had just married into. People were asking whether the Simmons empire was as stable as it appeared. She called me late one evening and asked directly whether I had released the documents to anyone outside the family. I told her I had not. Everything happening around us was the result of people drawing their own conclusions once the right details surfaced. By the end of the week, the tension surrounding the Simmons name had grown impossible to ignore. One of my father's largest international partners temporarily suspended a major diamond shipment while reviewing the compliance history of several transactions. Another partner quietly withdrew from a long-planned investment project. At the same time, financial institutions began examining accounts connected to my mother's fashion company more closely. None of the actions were public accusations, but they were enough to disrupt the rhythm of a business that depended on absolute confidence. Through all of this, I remained silent. I did not contact journalists or regulators. I did not publish accusations or post explanations online. The information that had reached the right ears was already enough to begin unraveling the illusion my parents had built over decades. Liam explained that once doubts enter a system built on reputation, the system begins investigating itself. People who once ignored warning signs suddenly become very interested in protecting their own position. 7 days after the wedding, the consequences reached my door. That evening, I heard a car stop outside my building. When I looked through the window, I saw 3 familiar figures stepping out under the streetlights. My father stood in front with the rigid posture he used when facing a difficult negotiation. My mother followed beside him, her usual confidence replaced by visible tension. Victoria walked a step behind them, her expression tired and uncertain. For the first time since the humiliation at the wedding, the 3 of them had come to me not as the powerful family that controlled every conversation in the room, but as people searching for a way to stop something they could no longer manage on their own. And as the doorbell rang, I already understood why they were there. When the doorbell rang that evening, I already knew who was standing on the other side. I opened the door slowly and found my father there first, his posture rigid beneath the pale hallway light. Marcus Simmons had always carried himself like a man who expected rooms to fall silent when he entered them. That confidence had built the empire everyone admired for decades. Tonight it looked different, not gone, but strained, like a structure that had begun to bend under pressure. My mother stood beside him with her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders, the effortless elegance she usually carried now replaced by something closer to anxiety. Victoria stood slightly behind them, her expression tired and uncertain, as if the last week had forced her to see our family from a completely different distance. For a moment, none of us spoke. The quiet between us felt heavier than the humiliation at the wedding or the confrontation at the dinner table. Finally, my father cleared his throat and stepped forward slightly. His voice remained controlled, the same calm tone he used when negotiating deals with investors. He said the situation surrounding the Simmons name had gone far enough and that the family needed to handle it privately before the damage became permanent. According to him, rumors had begun spreading through business circles and social networks that were threatening the reputation he had spent his entire life building. My mother tried a different tone. She spoke softly, telling me that the questions circulating about the diamond company and her fashion brand were destroying the image of the family. She said people were beginning to believe things that were exaggerated or misunderstood. Her eyes searched my face as if she expected sympathy or regret. For years, I had been the one asking questions while they dismissed my concerns as childish curiosity. Now they were the ones asking me to reconsider the truth. Victoria finally spoke after several seconds of silence. She admitted that the past week had been worse than she expected. Investors were hesitant, business partners were cautious, and friends who once admired our family were suddenly distant. She asked whether I planned to release the documents publicly or if there was still a way to stop everything before the situation became irreversible. Her voice carried none of the polished confidence she had shown at the wedding. Instead, it held the confusion of someone realizing the world she trusted might never have been as stable as it seemed. I told them the truth calmly. I had not contacted reporters. I had not sent the documents to regulators or business rivals. Everything that had happened during the week had unfolded naturally once the right questions began circulating. Secrets rarely collapse because someone attacks them. They collapse because too many people finally start looking in the same direction. My father stared at me with disbelief, as if he could not accept that the daughter he dismissed as a mistake now held the quiet center of the situation he could no longer control. Then he said the sentence that revealed the real reason they had come. "If I clarified things publicly," he said, "if I explained that the documents were misunderstood or incomplete, the damage might still be contained." My mother nodded quickly, adding that families protect each other when times become difficult. Victoria remained silent, watching my reaction carefully. For several seconds, I said nothing. I looked at the three people who had spent my entire life defining who I was supposed to be. The successful father admired by investors, the elegant mother admired by society, the perfect sister raised to inherit the family name, and standing in front of them was the daughter they had publicly erased in front of more than 1,000 guests only a week earlier. The strange part was that I no longer felt angry. The anger had burned itself out somewhere between the wedding stage and the quiet moment when the truth began spreading through their world. I told them quietly that the reason they were standing on my doorstep had nothing to do with understanding what they had done to me. They were not there because they finally realized how cruel the words at the wedding had been. They were there because for the first time the consequences of their choices had reached them personally. Losing me had never mattered to them. Losing their reputation did. The silence that followed felt longer than the entire conversation. My father opened his mouth as if he wanted to argue, but no words came. My mother lowered her eyes. Victoria looked from one of us to the other as if she were finally seeing the structure of our family clearly for the first time. After a moment, I stepped back and placed my hand on the doorframe. Before closing the door, I said the one sentence that had been forming quietly inside me for years. I told them I was never the mistake in this family. I was simply the consequence of everything they chose to hide. Then I closed the door and left them standing in the hallway outside my apartment. Through the window, I watched them walk slowly toward their car beneath the streetlights. The Simmons empire had not collapsed in a single moment, but the illusion that protected it had finally cracked. For the first time in my life, I felt something close to peace. And before this story ends, I want to ask you something. If you had been standing where I stood that night, hearing your own family erase you in front of the world, would you have stayed silent, or would you have revealed the truth no matter the cost? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you would have done in my place. If stories about resilience, consequences, and the courage to face difficult truths mean something to you, stay with the channel, subscribe, and be part of this community where we keep sharing stories that remind us silence is never the only choice.